South China Morning Post, 28th of March 2023, European leaders will press China on a peacemaking lie with a diplomatic flurry. European politicians are flocking to Beijing to examine the integrity of China's self-designation as a global peacemaker. Chinese President Xi Jinping will meet with Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez this week. Ursula von der Leyen, President of the European Commission, and French President Emmanuel Macron will do the same the following week. Top EU diplomat Josep Borrell will travel to Beijing for strategic dialogue with Foreign Minister Qin Gang before possibly attending the G7 Foreign Ministers Summit in Japan on April 16. Each will make an effort to persuade China not to give Russia armaments, as there are concerns in Europe that doing so could contribute to the outbreak of World War III. In Western European capitals, there is a perception that China's military involvement would tip the scales irreversibly in Moscow's favor and maybe spark a more significant battle, including NATO and the US. Speaking in private, government officials also warned that if the West stopped pressing China on weapons, Beijing would think it could get away with equipping Moscow. One official claimed that yes-men were everywhere around Xi. He doesn't hear about these topics frequently enough. Expectations for the trips were, according to a diplomat from Western Europe, reasonably low, but the very point of going and making these points in person makes them worthwhile. According to diplomats and experts, the Europeans will also test China's commitment to helping with the peace process in Ukraine while they are in Beijing. Von der Leyen and Borrell instantly disregarded a position paper for peace released by the Chinese Foreign Ministry last month as pro-Russian. Von der Leyen stated in February that we will look at the principles, of course, but we will look at them against the backdrop that China has taken sides. The EU rejects Beijing's misplaced initiative for peace in Ukraine. The view is still valid for many behind-the-scenes officials, who remain skeptical that China could broker peace given that Beijing is not perceived as neutral. But in recent weeks, the rhetoric in Brussels has been more polite. Instead of calling the idea a complete waste of time, diplomats now describe it as flawed. They emphasize that while Ukraine has not entirely rejected it, there are some areas where it and Kyiv's plan to end the war overlap. Some are curious if Xi would speak with Volodymyr Zelensky after his state visit to Moscow last week. Some worries continuing to criticize the plan will enrage developing nations that want to end the conflict, even if it means Ukraine losing some land and bringing Beijing and Moscow closer together. According to Grzegorz Stek, an expert on EU-China relations at the Mercator Institute for China Studies in Brussels, some in the EU seem to be calculating that Europe would not gain that much by strongly dismissing the Chinese position paper. This calculation, according to Stek, may be motivated by a desire to establish favorable conditions for a diplomatic reopening with China or by a desire to demonstrate to allies in the global south that the EU is seriously considering all peace ideas, even if in reality it does not believe in the likelihood of Chinese mediation. However, he continued, those actors spread China's narratives about Beijing purportedly acting as a force for peace. According to Miguel Otero, a senior analyst focusing on China at the Elcano Royal Institute in Madrid, Indian officials made their European counterparts uncomfortable at the Raisina dialogue in New Delhi in February for failing to offer a rebuttal to the Chinese perspective. The Indians believed that the Chinese strategy was ineffective, and many Europeans disdained it. "Where is your plan?" said Otero. This left the Europeans in an unpleasant position, and they reasoned that perhaps we ought to maintain a bit of distance and stop being so contemptuous. Many EU officials were taken aback by China's participation in using her financial clout to mediate a détente between Iran and Saudi Arabia this month. There is now a desire to test China's capacity for bringing about peace. However, regarding China, the one issue EU members can agree on is Ukraine. The matter was discussed at a conference behind closed doors last week. Still, there was little agreement on how the Union could modify its economic strategy for Beijing in such a dynamic environment. According to diplomats familiar with the talks, some believe the emphasis should be on de-risking European supply chains unduly reliant on China for products like solar panels and surgical masks. Others eagerly anticipated the Chinese economy's reopening and believed their country's exporters deserved a piece of the action. A diplomat added that this is the issue with the EU's strategy toward China. Its scope is so broad that it might refer to anything. Due to this dynamic, Macron and Sanchez will likely sign several bilateral business agreements in Beijing to stabilize their shaky economies. According to her spokeswoman, the agenda for von der Leyen was still being developed. However, She is perceived as close to U.S. Vice President Joe Biden's team and becoming more hawkish against Beijing. China is undoubtedly a vital partner of the European Union. I don't think you need a specific cause to go there, said spokesperson Eric Mamer on Monday in Brussels. The concerns that the no-limits friendship between China and Russia has created in the context of the Ukraine war, he said, have already been expressed by the president on several occasions. The leaders of Spain and France will also try to restore some balance in Europe's stance toward the US and China. Both are vocal supporters of the bloc's rumored strategic autonomy concept and are cautiously watching the US elections in 2016. In general, according to Otero, the Spanish analyst, who spoke with officials in Madrid, we cannot just be hijacked by the American agenda against China. It keeps coming up that there could be another Donald Trump, a different kind of new president in the White House, and then everything would alter once more. But not everyone in the EU is celebrating the excursions. Last Friday, Latvian Prime Minister Krinis Kari criticized China for its support of Russia. This is a challenge for all of us, he said. China is not taking the role of a broker, but is moving overtly on the side of Russia. He is not alone in Central and Eastern Europe in doubting Beijing's ability to provide much assistance. Marcin Przybylski, a China analyst at the Polish Institute of International Affairs and a former diplomat in Beijing, said that Spain, France, and Germany feel the obligation to strengthen relations with China, through the visits, to gain economic advantages in exchange for the support for Xi's peace narrative. The leaders of Central and Eastern Europe just do not feel convinced that such an exchange is valuable in terms of possible solutions to the existing Russian aggression on Ukraine, he continued.